Good morning and happy Sunday again, everybody. Pastor Bryan here. We are nearing the end of our June sermon series, Spiritual Shifts, in which we've been taking away a look at the ways that the Spirit continues to alter the understanding of the followers of Jesus through the book of Acts in the hopes that we might come to some better understanding of what it means to be led by the Spirit in our own lives. Today, we start off by talking about church conflict. Now, conflict in the church is nothing new. It's well documented throughout the church's history. The passage that we're focusing on today, for example, Acts chapter 15, verses 1 to 12, and a little ways after that, talks about the first really big council, if you will, the first really big debate that the church has within itself. And it has to do with how Gentiles are brought into the faith. Do they need to be circumcised and abide by Jewish law, the law of Moses, as it's often referred to in the Bible? Or are we saved by grace through Jesus Christ? One of the earliest church debates. And again, debates are nothing new in the church. I mean, if you stop and even have a cursory understanding, even the most basic understanding of history, you will see not only that the church fights within itself, but that these decisions sometimes take a long time to make, and they're still going on to this day. I mean, you can look at the understanding that the church had early on about the earth's place in the universe. And for a long time, it was believed through Ptolemaic reasoning that the earth was the center of the universe and that all the celestial bodies revolved around it. In the Old Testament, in the Old Testament Bible, you get a sense that the way they viewed the world was this kind of what we might consider today to be this flat earth, which we know is not the case. The earth is not flat. We now also know that the earth is not the center of the universe. Thanks to a man named Galileo Galilei and Copernicus, who through research, through science, determined that the sun was the center of our solar system. The earth revolved around that, but then the sun is also, eventually we would discover, revolving itself around a black hole at the center of the Milky Way galaxy. Later in history, you have an individual by the name of Charles Darwin who proposes one of the first understandings of evolution, of adaptation, of how animals can change based on where they find themselves through generations, as he discovered on the Galapagos Islands. And that caused the church to get into a fight with itself. I mean, in the Old Testament, we hear stories of God creating everything and that everything is good, everything is perfect. So what does it mean that we now have an understanding that things change and grow and adapt and evolve over millennia? Right? Even within the church itself, there are additional arguments, but the difference between the church fighting the outside world and the church fighting within itself has to do with, well, regardless of who the church is debating with, who the church is fighting with, however you want to phrase it, it all revolves around one basic question, for the most part. And that one basic question is, what is essential and what is not? What is the picture and what can we consider to be the framework? Right? So for Galileo, for example, and the heliocentric model of the solar system, Christians, as they debated, as they discussed it, ultimately it boils down to, is it essential for our faith to understand the earth as the center of everything? And the answer was no. When it came to Charles Darwin, even though in America there was a little bit more conflict about it, and we don't have time to go into debates and discussions about why that's the case. But again, the question boils down to, is it essential for the faith? Is it part of the bigger picture that evolution is a thing that happens, or is it part of the frame, part of the thing that supports it, part of the understanding that we have of it? And eventually the church gets around to saying, well, those two things are framework. It's not essential to this main picture of the faith, but it helps us understand God a little more. Why am I sharing this? Well, it's pretty simple. It's because today, as we continue our series on spiritual shifts, we're talking about church conflict, as I already said. We're taking a look at one of the biggest debates within the church in the book of Acts, and that is how Gentiles fit into the larger picture of Christianity as it's revealed to us in the lead up to and a little bit past Acts chapter 15, verses 1 through 12. And to fully understand what we're hearing today, it's important that we get a little bit of background information. And to get that background information, we actually have to go all the way back to the first message of the series, which focused on the stoning of Stephen. Stephen had this proclamation, for those of you who remember, and those of you who don't, it's a brief refresher. Stephen was an up-and-coming star in the early church. He was preaching, he was doing good things, Gentile believer. As far as we could tell, he was Greek. And he had this message, the longest speech in the book of Acts, which ultimately boils down to the faith that we have cannot be contained by a single nation. It cannot be contained by a single people. It is a faith for everybody, everywhere. It is what we would now consider to be a universal faith. It's for everybody, whether they want to be a part of it or not. The option is open to them to be a part of it. And Stephen gets killed for that. Immediately after that, a lot of the early members of the church flee. They leave Jerusalem. They're terrified at what they've just experienced. They don't want anything to do with it. So they scatter across, essentially the Roman Empire. You have some that go to places like Phoenicia and Cyprus. The ones we're going to focus on today, though, are the ones that flee to a place called Antioch. Now, those believers who went to Antioch, they continued to live their faith life. They continued to preach the good news. They continued to bring people into the church. And eventually the people the followers of Jesus who stayed in Jerusalem hear about this, and they want to verify that they're being taught things the way they're supposed to be taught. So they send our old friend Barnabas to go and investigate. Barnabas goes to Antioch. He verifies that everything they've been hearing is true, that everything's going okay. He gets very excited about what's happening in Antioch. He encourages them to continue doing what they're doing. And in the midst of all of that, he travels to Tarsus, which for those of you who remember who were here last week will know is where Paul is currently staying, as the church is trying to figure out what to do with Paul. Barnabas goes to Tarsus, finds Saul. I misspoke earlier. He's still Saul at this point. And he invites him to come to Antioch. Hey, there is something amazing going on in Antioch. Will you come with me and help me strengthen this community? And Saul says, yeah. And there's so much good going on in Antioch that Barnabas and Paul stay in Antioch for a year, preaching and teaching. And the Bible even makes mention that it is from this faith community that we originally get followers of Christ being referred to as Christians. This is, according to the Bible, the first time followers of Christ are being known as Christians. The believers in Jerusalem continue to hear good things about Antioch. While they're there, they have this spiritual vision of a famine that might be coming to the region. So they send emissaries once again to Antioch, say, hey, we think there might be a famine coming. Is there anything that you can help us do to prepare for that? Barnabas and Paul say, yeah, we'll start taking up a collection. They start taking up an offering. Barnabas and Paul take it themselves to Jerusalem. Now, while Barnabas and Paul are in Jerusalem, one of the older figures from the New Testament, a guy by the name of King Herod, not the one from when Jesus was a baby, his son, if I remember correctly, decides to start harassing the followers of Jesus a little bit. And one of the first things he does is he captures one of the central figures, one of the inner circle of Jesus, if we remember, was Peter, James, and John. They capture James, the brother of John, one of the two sons of thunder, and he is executed. The first disciple outside of Judas to die, the first of the original 12 to be martyred. And sadly, his death only gets a brief mention in one verse. It says, while this was going on, James was put to the sword. The Jews respond positively in Jerusalem to this. So in a response, Herod begins harassing the church more. And part of that harassment involves putting Peter, who we talked extensively about last week, in jail. Peter has what he thinks is a vision, what ends up being kind of part dream, part reality, escapes from prison with the help of an angel. He winds up at the house of one of the followers of Jesus, another woman by the name of Mary, who we find out is the mother of a guy named John Mark, who pay attention to John Mark because we're going to be talking about him more next week. And they initially don't believe Peter escaped, but he eventually says, yeah, it's me, let me in. He tells them to inform the others that he's out of jail. He disappears. Nobody knows where he goes. Best guess for me is that he goes to Antioch. We get this story from the letter to the Galatians of Peter going and visiting going to visit the church in Antioch, and Paul and Peter get into a bit of a conflict because it seems that when Peter initially gets there, he's more than happy to eat and to engage in fellowship with the Gentile believers of Christ. You remember he converted Gentiles last week, the conversion of Cornelius and his family. It's nothing new for Peter. But the problem arises when other people from the Judean church, the Jerusalem church, go to Antioch. And Peter is apparently afraid of these people, so he stops engaging in fellowship with the Gentiles, which causes Paul to call him out to his face and in front of everybody. We're sidetracking a little bit, but that is important. It does build up. Herod is eventually killed, the Bible says, by an angel of the Lord. And after Herod dies, Barnabas and Saul return to Antioch. And they take John Mark with them. He's this young believer. He's full of the Spirit. He wants to kind of get a feel for what's going on. And it's in this moment, Barnabas and Saul become reversed, where Barnabas was the leader of the group from here on out. Now, Saul, who is going to be known as Paul from here on out, becomes the leader of the group. So instead of it saying Barnabas and Saul, it's now going to say Paul and Barnabas as you continue reading. They go to Seleucia, they go to Cyprus, they go to Salamis. They end up converting the governor of Cyprus after an encounter with a sorcerer, which you can read about yourself. They go to Pamphylia, and while they're in Pamphylia, for some reason, we don't know, John Mark deserts the group. He just packs up, leaves, goes to Jerusalem. That's going to leave a bad taste in Paul's mouth, and we'll talk about that next week. So they continue on without him. They end up in a different Antioch as Saul preaches there. The Jews reject Paul in that other Antioch, and so he and Barnabas focus on Gentiles. When they overstay their welcome, they move on to somewhere else. They go to Iconium. Another plot is hatched against Paul and plot to take his life. So they go to a place called Lystra. While they're in Lystra, there's this massive understanding. Paul is stoned to the point of near death, dragged outside of the city, and effectively left for dead. He survives and returns to Antioch, ending what is commonly known as Paul's first missionary journey. They stay in Antioch until this council takes place. And as we read in the passage for today, what ends up happening is there is clearly factions within the church already. That's nothing new. There is clearly politics being played in the church at this point. There is a group of converts who were former Pharisees in their past life who have a more what people would call conservative, more traditional understanding of their faith. And they start going around to the different places where Paul's been, saying it's grace through Jesus Christ is not enough for salvation. In order to have salvation, you have to essentially be Jewish. You have to be circumcised. You have to follow the laws of Moses, even though this was all but settled already through Peter's encounter with Cornelius. These people are intentionally stirring up trouble. They're stirring up an issue that is a non-issue, or should be a non-issue. Paul and Barnabas don't like this. They go to Jerusalem to plead their case, and we get the Jerusalem Council. Now, it says there was a lot of debate going on in the council. We don't know fully what the debate was, but we do know the sides. On the one side, you had the, again, for lack of a better understanding, the conservative traditional understanding of the Pharisees. On the more liberal side, you had people like Peter, Paul, and Barnabas. And in the middle of the road, the person who's kind of overseeing the entirety of the council is a guy by the name of James. James, by this point, has become kind of the de facto leader of the church in Jerusalem, probably around the time Peter starts going out and leaving Jerusalem to go and do his own ministry journeys, his own missionary journeys. And James wants to hear him out. We don't know what was said at that council other than Peter's brief speech and a report that Paul and Barnabas shared their experiences. They didn't argue from a theological perspective. Rather, they fortified Peter's understanding by saying, Peter's right. This is what we've been seeing as we've been going to all of these different places. We can, however, make educated guesses about what each side argued. Because, as it would be no surprise to any of us today, we still have conservative traditional viewpoints. We still have liberal progressive viewpoints. We still have a bunch of people in the middle who tend to kind of weave in and out of these viewpoints, or maybe have their own view that's straight down the middle and they don't want to hear from either side. From a conservative position, it's possible that they were arguing that the old established ways of community in the Old Testament, they have strong, valid claims. That it's the tried and true way. It's the way it's always been. And we shouldn't jettison something unless there is ample evidence that proves that the system's no longer working. It's possible that they argued that you can't simply just throw out this generations-long system that we believe was given to us by God. You could have straw man arguments in place, like, well, if you're going to get rid of circumcision, then what's next? Then you're going to get rid of the 10 Commandments, and then what happens after that? You're going to get rid of that. It's you stack up all these dominoes and you knock them all over and say it's a slippery slope, an argument we still get in politics to this day. They remind the people there potentially that look at what the law, look at what our values have gotten us through so far. Who's to say it won't continue to get us through whatever might come in the future? And you want to take all of that and replace it with what? A vague understanding of love and grace? Let's also not forget, Jesus was circumcised. If it was good enough for Jesus, why isn't it good enough for the Gentiles? Are they saying that they have some backdoor method of salvation? The liberals would have given their viewpoint. And again, it was best expressed by Peter, who says, look, I've seen the Spirit working and moving in a new way. I was in an entire house of Gentiles. I ate with them. The Spirit came down in an event similar to the one that we here all experienced. They weren't circumcised. They still got the Spirit. There's clearly something new going on. Meanwhile, James is listening. He's being the arbiter of the debate. He's giving both sides equal time. James himself tends to be a little more conservative according to church tradition, but he at least has the grace to hear people out and to be fair with his decisions. He's not going to side with the conservatives just because he's a conservative. He is going to take in all the information and help determine what the best route forward is. And what James ends up doing is he ends up coming up with a compromise. There is this passage in Leviticus in the Old Testament that talks about the law requirements for Gentiles who live in the Holy Land. So if you're a Gentile, you're welcome to live in the Holy Land, but there are bare minimum laws that you have to follow, not to burden you, not as saying, well, these are the requirements, but more so that fellowship between Jews and Gentiles can be possible. Because Jews, the people of the Mosaic covenant, they have to follow their laws. They have to follow the Torah. And granted, now we have just like back then, there are different factions in Judaism that believe greater or lesser extent. You have the very orthodox, what it says is what we do. You have the more progressive Judaism that says that, well, maybe we don't have to do all the dietary restrictions, things like that. But it made fellowship possible. Those laws in Leviticus made it so that Jews could engage with Gentiles with a relatively sincere understanding that they would not be violating their own faith. It's a hospitality thing. And so James comes up with the solution, right? He says, let me see if I can find it here, because they do end up sending out a letter, right? They end up sending out a letter. James says, I conclude that we shouldn't create problems for Gentiles who turn to God, that if they want to turn to God, they should turn to God. We shouldn't create problems. Instead, we'll write a letter telling them to avoid the pollution associated with idols, immorality of various kinds, eating meat from strangled animals, and consuming blood. After all, Moses had been proclaimed in every city for a long time. It's somebody that they should know. And it's read aloud every Sabbath in every synagogue. So if they are Gentiles who are already going to synagogue, this isn't going to be a surprise to them. They send out a letter. The letter says, the apostles and the elders to the Gentile brothers and sisters in Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia, greetings. We've heard that some of our number have disturbed you with unsettling words we did not authorize. We reached a united decision to select some delegates and send them to you along with our dear friends Barnabas and Paul. These people have devoted their lives to the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, in addition to Barnabas and Paul, we are sending Judas and Silas. They will confirm what we have written. They are the witnesses to this whole event. The Holy Spirit has led us to a decision about this question that you guys have been having, that no burden should be placed on you other than the essentials. Right? Refuse food offered to idols, blood, the meat from strangled animals, and immorality. You will do well to avoid such things. Farewell. That's it. The end, case closed. It's a compromise. But again, as we sit and we think about our past as Christians, as we think about our current situation in many Christian denominations in the United Methodist Church, it's no surprise that we are currently going through our own struggle, our own debate. Our debate at the moment, which has been going on for a number of years at this point, has to do with how the members of the LGBTQ community can be included in the faith life. In addition to that, mostly revolving around marriage, there is a second tier to that doesn't get reported on as often, and it is, what are the requirements for an LGBTQ plus person who wants to become ordained in the church? The current position is that in addition to the vows that every other ordinand, every other person who wants to be a reverend has to take to become commissioned, to become fully ordained in the United Methodist Church, the LGBTQ members have to take an additional vow of celibacy. That's what those two things, the marriage and ordination, those are the two things. But there's a deeper fight going on, and it's why church arguments, church discussions, church debates tend to last for long periods of time. It's not a simple yes, no, up, down as we would like it to be, and rarely in the faith journey are the answers that we find simple yes, no, up, down. It's a question of, is it essential? Is it is it part of the picture of Christianity itself? Is it part of the salvation by grace, salvation through faith in Jesus Christ? Or is it a part of the framework and how we understand it, how we live out our faith life? Just like all conflicts, it will eventually resolve itself. Most likely, there's going to be some kind of satellite denominations that jettison off of the larger United Methodist Church, one a little bit more progressive, one a little bit more conservative. The United Methodist Church that remains most likely is going to kind of take a middle road. From what I'm hearing, it's going to say effectively, we don't want to fight about it anymore. So what we're going to do is we're going to let every local church, let every pastor decide based on their understanding. Well, that would have been nice before the fight. Live and let live. I've always had this image of the United Methodist Church as kind of being unique in the sense that it is big tent Christianity. It's that John Wesley, the founder of the denomination, would often come out and say, we don't have to vote for the same people politically. We don't have to have the same understandings of the world. The one thing we do need to share, the one thing that's essential in our understanding of how we are to engage in fellowship with one another is that we all love God, that we have all been called, that we all have the same mission to go out and to make disciples and to transform the world, to do all the good we can by all the means we can and all the ways that we can for as long as we can. Church conflict is nothing new. The biggest difference is that we're living through it. I mean, it's one thing to read about conflicts and debates and discussions in school and in books, but it is an entirely different beast altogether to be living through a moment where a shift is happening. That council at Jerusalem should have been a foregone conclusion. It should not have been something that had to be stated again because Peter had already taken care of it. But it happened. And they sat down. They talked about it in a civilized manner. They let everybody say their piece. They came to a decision that most likely most people were okay with, but it doesn't please everybody. It's compromise in its simplest form. The Pharisee group, they probably weren't happy with the decision. The more progressive people, maybe they weren't happy with that decision, but it was a decision they could all live with. As we prepare to end this time to go on to whatever it is we're planning on doing for the rest of our day and the rest of the week, I encourage you to keep the Jerusalem Council in your mind. Because we see brokenness in the world all around us. A lot of it comes from people who are too stubborn to relent, who say, my way or the highway, and that runs the gambit across the political spectrum. There's a reason nothing gets done, and it's because everybody thinks they're right. Nobody wants to admit that there is some wiggle room. We've become too polarized. We become too sure of our own understanding. And if there's one thing that we've learned from the entirety of this series, it's that we can't be sure of our own understandings for the entirety of our life. That the Spirit continues to move. The Spirit continues to change. Yes, we have the Bible, and different people in Christianity understand the Bible in different ways. It might be a shock to you, but most of you, if you take the time to pay attention, will realize that we don't even understand the Bible the same way. There are many Christians who vote conservative. There are many Christians who vote Democrat. There are many Christians who vote for green parties or libertarians. There are Christians across the political spectrum, but the only ones that get their voices heard are the ones that are the loudest. And that further polarizes us. God doesn't call us to set up factions. God doesn't call us to find a group and stick with it forever. God encourages us to learn and grow and come to deeper understandings, not in a bubble, not in isolation, but together. If you find yourself in the middle of a road, cars coming, what are you going to do? You're going to make a decision. You're either going to go back the way you came or you're going to continue across the road. Think about that metaphor. Because right now we are in a society where there are people on one side of the road, people on the other side of the road. And they're trying to make decisions about the best way to get across the road without venturing into the middle of the road. And if you really pay attention, you might start to realize that it's not until we get into the middle of the road, when our feet are to the fire, when a decision has to be made, when both sides give something, that we're allowed to continue down the road. God calls us together. And that's really all there is to it. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we can become so jaded and tired of the debates and the discussions and the political maneuvering by all of the parties in our country, in our communities across the world. We hear the things that sound good and we say that's how it must be, and we dig our feet in and we do not budge. All the while forgetting that you don't call us to stay put, just as your Spirit doesn't stay put. You call us to be in the world and of the world, to set differences aside, to work together, to try to make the world a better place where we are. You call us to be your hands and feet, and yet we continue to find our hands and feet tied by our stubbornness and our adherence to our own positions. Today we ask that you soften our hearts, that you open us up to the voices of the people that we don't agree with, that you open up our minds to their understanding, to come to the conclusion that the old ways are good, but that there are times when they need to be adjusted, that we need one another, for none of us are called to exist in a bubble. You called fishermen, you called tax collectors, you called people who hated tax collectors. Yet those were not the labels that you gave them. For the label that you gave them above all else, the only one that matters, is beloved. Help us to remember that as we ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. I hope you have an amazing week, whatever it may bring. I hope you find moments of peace, and I hope that you continue to think about the Jerusalem Council and what it means to be not as stubborn as we all tend to be. I'll see you next time.